Welcome back to How to Make Climate Change Sexy, the podcast where I dive into conversations with guests who are using culture and innovation to address the climate crisis. Together, we'll explore how their creative approaches can become powerful tools for driving the change our planet needs. And also, welcome to Season 2. I'm so excited to start sharing this new season with the world. I've had some wonderful conversations with a wide range of guests, and I'm glad that they're finally getting to your ears and not just living on my computer. While I love making climate memes for Instagram, it's been so fun to dive deeper into climate conversations, and I hope you enjoy this new season. So, today I'm incredibly excited to sit down with Will Eliot, the founder of Biocrafting Studio. Will's work is fascinating. He's pioneering biocollaborative design, literally working with nature. His work's at the cutting edge of what it even means to be a designer, with the goal of reshaping our relationship with the environment. In this episode, we discuss his various projects from mealworms that digest polystyrene to creating wooden robots. And we're going to explore everything from his childhood inspirations, and that includes Miyazaki films like Princess Mononoke, to his unique approach to designing in partnership with nature, not just mimicking it. This conversation is full of insights on symbiotic design and the untapped potential of biomaterials, and I really hope you enjoy our conversation. Hi, Will. Welcome to How to Make Climate Change Sexy. To start off, I think it would be good if you introduce yourself and tell everyone how you're trying to make climate change sexy.
Hi, my name's Will. I'm the founder of Biocrafting Studio, and I think I'm trying to make climate change sexy by showcasing the beauty and the wonder of nature in places that people don't usually see them. So whether that be dead plants or mealworms or dirt, I find that there's a lot of hidden magic in there, and I use design practices and craft methodologies to basically reveal that and come up with new solutions to problems that collaborate with nature and show people another way of looking at it.
And from that perspective, how did you come to take that approach in your work? Unfortunately, right now, that's not a traditional route that people take coming out of design training or entering the media world. It's not normal to be so engaged with nature. So how did you come to that relationship?
Yeah, I think I've had a very sort of roundabout, people talk about squiggly careers. I've definitely done lots of different things in my life that's maybe led me to this point. But if I were to really think about the genesis, the initial point, it was probably when I was growing up in Japan. I'm half Japanese, and watching all the Miyazaki films, especially Princess Mononoke, where it really documents and showcases this kind of relationship that humans have with nature. And I think that sort of tumultuous relationship that they show, the kind of mysticism there as well, the sort of animism in the things that quite often we think are not alive, has really stuck with me. And so I think I've always just had a fascination with that kind of energy that you have with nature, especially in Japanese forests and things like that. There's a heaviness there. I think it's probably something to do with the high humidity and the heat and stuff like that. It just feels like there's an energy going on. And so that's always captured my imagination. And then basically, as I sort of progressed through my career and I've done various things, I ended up as a designer. I think this kind of new trend or movement in design where we start thinking about non-human intelligence and beings, and how do we sort of understand things that aren't humans, then kind of put them at an equal foothold as us, and sort of go from this Anthropocene to the Symbiocene. That was something that really aligns to those initial thoughts. It sort of really articulated these thoughts that I had in my head in a really crystalline, clear way. And so from there, basically started exploring all these amazing biomechanisms and things that happen in nature. Got fascinated with biodesign. The work of Neri Oxman and the Silkworm Pavilions is probably kind of one of those flagship hero projects that people outside of the space are familiar with. But if you kind of dive deeper, people like Julia Watson, who does a lot of research into, she calls it low tech, LOTEK, which is sort of indigenous technologies, basically. And so looking at how throughout the past, there's a lot of indigenous knowledge that kind of harnesses nature and collaborates with nature to create, permaculture systems and ecosystems that are self-sustaining, that benefit both the humans and the planet. And that sort of just became the starting point, and I started diving deeper and deeper in my practice within all of that.
I love Princess Mononoke. It's also my favorite, even though I love Totoro. And I think that's so true, like thinking about animism and design and the relationships with that sense of place in Japan, because everything's so specific and considered, and that relationship to place is stronger through an animist perspective. So I think for anyone who is new to a lot of these terms, what do you mean when you say biodesign?
Biodesign is one of those catch-all terms which can be quite hard to define. So I think the initial wave of it that I've seen was more kind of biomimicry. So people taking inspiration from nature to inspire design. So it might be a lattice framework that they see at a cellular level. How do you sort of create like a nanomaterial or something like that to be able to design a new sort of sheet material, something like that? And then more recently, we're starting to see people kind of grow things. You know, MIT have this course called How to Grow Almost Anything, and it kind of shows like the interest people have in terms of like making things with bacteria or making, you know, biomaterials out of certain things. Mycelium is obviously very trendy, but there's all sorts of other stuff like biochar, which basically are kind of sustainable alternatives to the current kind of industry standards. And then where I'm moving my practice and kind of where I think a lot of interesting things are happening is around biocollaborative design. So you're not just making things out of nature in this sort of extractive way, but you're coming up with collaborative processes with nature to either fabricate and grow things and make things within a sort of ecosystem. So I think with biodesign now, there's like an ecosystems level thinking that you have to have, where it's not just you as a designer in your workshop making something, in your studio making something, but you're really thinking about where do these materials come from? What are the organisms that live within it? Can you design for those organisms within it while still doing the kind of day-to-day job at the same time?
Yeah, so it's shifting the approach from biomimicry, which is extractivist, and you're just taking from nature to kind of reposition yourself as with nature or working alongside nature.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that then sort of turns your practice into quite a multidisciplinary one. You're no longer just on a computer making nice shapes and then fabricating them, but rather you have to have a certain level of scientific knowledge, biological knowledge. And if you don't have that yourself, then you have to be a good collaborator and sort of work with people with domain specialisms and things like that. So for example, with the hygromechanisms, which is basically looking at wood as an intelligent material, part of the research process is going out and meeting regenerative coppices, basically. So people that it's a way of being able to kind of get wood from the land in a way that doesn't totally destroy the entire ecosystem there, because the wood is able to grow back after 7 years. But there's a lot of like hidden knowledge there that we don't have, and it's really hard to get when you're just sat in your studio. So a big part of my practice is just being able to kind of get out of the studio, chat to people, understand their perspective, but then how do I come at it from a designer's perspective and come at it from a creative perspective that might be unconventional or inspiring or something that sort of gets people thinking.
Yeah, and talking of different approaches, I've read before that you've spoken about degeneration and degenerative design. What do you mean by that?
We live in a world now where we've just created so much stuff. And I think we didn't really think about what happens at the end of life of a lot of the objects that are around us. And, you know, AI as well. Things are so easy to generate now. And so I think it's an interesting thing to kind of flip it on its head and start thinking about degeneration as a creative process. And so looking at decay, the natural parts of, you know, things breaking down and how that might become something creative. I think we're often kind of shying away from that sort of thing because it reminds us of death and destruction and things like that. But actually, there can be a lot of beauty in decay as well. And so it's just about reframing it and showing it in a context that makes sense and documenting that process. So what I've been doing most recently is working with mealworms that are able to digest polystyrene safely. And so there's a lot of scientific research into the fact that mealworms basically can live off polystyrene, which is incredible. They can basically break down this kind of chemical compound and turn it into something organic and then convert that into carbon dioxide and energy effectively. And so, you know, there's a lot of scientists researching that. And I'm a designer. I'm not necessarily going to add anything in the scientific domain, but I think I'm really interested in these, you know, novel biocollaborative processes. So I started thinking about how could we actually like work together on something? How could, if the mealworm were, you know, directing a project, or if they had input into how this project should be run, how we should collaborate, what would actually happen? And so I basically started designing sculptures and forms in collaboration with the mealworms to create furniture, amongst other things. And yeah, basically positioning the mealworms as the creative director telling me what to do when I'm making something.
Yeah, that's so cool. The idea that like generative design and constant generation is so easy. Like that's not the challenge. Like we don't have a challenge in production. Like the challenge we face now is reducing production, degrowth, degeneration, but also framing these things as fun challenges because like you say, like no one wants to think about degrowth or degeneration because it's a reminder of the lack of power that we have in the natural world, which people never really quite want to admit, that we don't know as much as nature does. And also obviously our own lifespans being shorter. You mentioned the mealworm project. Can you describe for me because you have this key piece of furniture. So what have you made? What have you and the mealworms made? Or maybe I should position it, the mealworms and you, what have you guys made?
Yeah, so effectively I've created a stool, a piece of furniture that the mealworms have designed by eating the polystyrene. And I guess equally important as the stool is designing the process as well, because I think that's a big part of biocollaborative design. It's like it's not just about the output and the aesthetics of it, but really thinking about a new paradigm in terms of how we design and make things in collaboration with nature, which totally rethinks like all the tools that we use and all the different technology that we have available to us. We basically have to kind of rethink that. And not to go on a total tangent, but I think a lot of the bio solutions that are out there, sustainable solutions, they're kind of trying to position themselves as like silver bullets of like, oh, we'll just switch out this material for something else. But then actually you haven't rethought the entire system. And I think if you stay within the system, as you say, it's all in favor of growth and extracting kind of resources. And so we're really just replacing one problem with another problem that's just going to bite us later down the line. And so I think a big part of what I'm doing is designing an entirely new process that hopefully will eventually down the line start getting us to think about, okay, how do we totally rethink global supply chains? How do we totally rethink the way that we use CNC routers to carve out things? You know, there's a lot of waste that comes out of all these different processes, but it's all so entrenched that it's really hard to think of a way out of it. And so I think coming up with these like very radically different biological processes helps us to reimagine that world. And so what I do is effectively I get waste polystyrene that I found. I sort of go foraging around and find waste polystyrene and make blocks out of them or take inspiration from the shapes. And then I'll inject thin sugar trails into it. And so that sort of becomes the scaffold and the framework for the mealworms. And because they're attracted to the high calorie substance of the sugar, they'll basically start eating that first. And then they'll start kind of diving around and veering off and creating their own little tunnels. And that's when the kind of interesting thing happens where I don't really have control over the process. And after a certain amount of time, it depends on the scale of the polystyrene and how many mealworms I'm working with. So with the stool, it took about 3 or 4 weeks. After a certain period of time, I'll remove the mealworms from the polystyrene and cast that. And that is almost like a snapshot in time of what the mealworms have done. And I'll extract that cast out, and that becomes the kind of starting point for fabricating a piece of furniture. And, you know, I'd sometimes like going with the best, like most recently I was trying to make a table, but it comes out and you're like, that's not a table. Like it's not going to work as a table, but it gets you thinking about other things that you might be able to do with the form. And so it's almost like the mealworms of like challenging me to come up with a even more exciting new idea that I maybe hadn't considered beforehand. And so I think this kind of goes back to the generative thing. I think we have so much control. You know, we're like literally typing in word for word what we want into AI. We're controlling things down to a millimeter in computer animated drawing software. It's kind of all of that stuff gives us so much control. And I feel like it's just producing more and more bland work, weirdly. Like when we have total control as humans, we don't get to more interesting things. And rather, we need to find more interesting, diverse inputs, right? And you can sort of see parallels in the corporate world, I guess, with like D&I. Like the more diverse people you have and diverse non-humans, you will get to more interesting kind of results. And so, yeah, I basically find inspiration through an element of randomness and relinquishing control that the mealworms then provide.
And what sort of scale are you working with when you work with the mealworms to create the stool? How big was this block of polystyrene that you're injecting into? Because obviously I had imagined that you were working at full size, but I'm forgetting like how tiny they actually are.
Yeah, so I am working on scaling it up because there are a lot of steps to it. And it does feel a bit less biocollaborative when you kind of start involving so much technology, because I 3D scan the objects and things like that to be able to kind of then scale it up digitally. So I am trying to reduce that and scale it up. But for the stool itself, it was a fairly small kind of 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter block. And so that doesn't require that many mealworms as well. So at the scale that I'm working at and the sort of funding and the resources that I have, that's pretty convenient. There are ambitions though to scale, because currently it's hard to find a workshop. Most design studios aren't geared up for you to house a bunch of mealworms, or a lot of this biodesign stuff isn't really suited for a standard design studio. You kind of need to be in a lab and in order to grow mycelium and things like that. And so it kind of goes back to that interdisciplinary thing. You're kind of working at the intersections of these two spots, and you kind of have to create your own workspace. So a lot of people that I see that are doing this kind of bio stuff, it's very DIY. People who are doing really interesting stuff in mycelium, they're in their garage with plastic bags, sterilizing things and finding waste. And that sort of inspired one of the more recent things that I've been working on, which is an exhibition called Out of the Lab, which is all about how designers are taking these biodesign principles, but then kind of doing it in their own way and really kind of getting that. I don't know, there's something about the biodesign world from 10 years ago to now, which you just imagine in a sterile white lab with, people in lab coats with pipettes and things like that. But actually, I think designers now are realizing that you don't have to be in such a controlled environment to do that. You can sort of create your own space and kind of get to solutions really quickly, but in a sort of dirty, messy way, which feels right for nature. If you're working with nature, it should be kind of messy and dirty, I think. And so a lot of the stuff that I just do at home in a shed with the mealworms. But, I do best practice. I have temperature control in there. I have a humidity sensor. I do everything right. It's possible now with the accessibility to all the tools to be able to actually do it properly. But it just means that you're kind of having to improvise a little bit. It's not all done in the studio and things like that. So with the polystyrene, it's all happening at a small scale. And I still think it's kind of, obviously I'm creating furniture out of the polystyrene and the mealworms, but there's a lot of kind of experimentation too. And so before I get to the larger scales, experimenting at smaller scales is a great way to kind of learn things really quickly. And we call it kind of lo-fi prototyping in design. It's trying out things really quickly, and it might not be the final result, but you've learned so much that it makes that final result more solid, and you have this body of work that you can build on. It's sort of trying to build an empirical sort of body of work before you then commit to the final thing. I have been thinking a lot about kind of the Princess Mononoke story and things like that. It's why am I drawn to this stuff? Why does it interest me? And I think we live in a world where a lot of innovation and new ideas has to be justified by capitalist growth. And none of the solutions it doesn't make sense to make all our chairs of mealworms. It's not a viable thing. But for me, it's really what interests me is kind of showing this other side of nature and showing this kind of more symbiotic relationship between the two that then might inspire other people to think, okay, instead of using sheet metal for this next project, which is super easy to mass manufacture and things like that, what might be a more biocollaborative process that we can then incorporate and still do at scale potentially, but it becomes something that has a wider scale impact, which I think is quite hard to justify right now.
Yeah, I think it's also obviously it is about the object, but you're kind of really shining a light on this process and resituating how we understand our relationship to nature and bringing it up to a pairing. I think I really like it as a pairing because it reminds me of people start out in ad agencies and you have the copywriter and you have the designer. And something that I didn't realize is that a lot of these pairings meet at uni and then they just stay together. If they're lucky and if the relationship works, they can stay together for their whole careers. And I thought that was so beautiful. And I guess it's mirrored in this. Maybe you're kind of being more like the copywriter and the director, and the mealworms are your creative. And obviously in those relationships, always going to be challenges and frictions. What are the challenges and the frictions that you've encountered in this process of collaborative design?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think compared to most forms of design, you are effectively dealing with an organism that's alive, right? And so then comes a whole host of responsibilities that you have to sort of then take up. So as I was saying, being able to build the system to keep them kind of healthy and happy was a big challenge, right? It's sort of, you have to build the housing for it, then you have to have the temperature control, then you have to have the temperature sensors. And so being able to maintain that at a constant temperature is tricky, especially in the UK when there's such fluctuations in temperature and things like that. And so that's a big challenge. I think the other one also is kind of, these are living organisms that have a full life beyond the project, much like humans need work-life balance and things like that. You start sort of empathizing with the mealworms. And so initially I just had them on a polystyrene diet, and then I started to realize like, oh, actually, it can't be good for them to only be eating polystyrene. And so you start introducing other forms of food, and it's like you're compromising on efficiency in terms of like how much you can probably get done. But then, you start building up empathy for them, and you're like, okay, actually it makes sense to sort of give them the equivalent of a 5 a day fruit and veg, put in some bananas, or was more like kind of just waste stuff, so like potato peel and things like that is kind of stuff that works well. Yeah, giving them a varied diet. And then I guess the trickiest thing is like what happens at the end of the project, right? Like what happens when the mealworms are no longer eating the polystyrene, no longer designing? What is the most kind of ethical thing that you can do? And if I'm going to be honest, like I haven't really fully figured that out, because there's so many different options, but quite a lot of them are like systematically like tricky to sort of incorporate yourself into. And so the one that feels like makes the most sense, but maybe is kind of probably the most brutal, is that they're part of this ecosystem already. Mealworms are farmed for chicken feed, and so you're able to buy them super easily. You literally kind of just order them online and they arrive at your front door, and then I can start working with them. And after you've kind of weaned them off the polystyrene diet for 2 weeks, they're basically plastic free. And so in reintroducing them back into the chicken feed ecosystem sort of makes sense to me, if you believe in sort of chicken farming and things like that. But there was also something weird about, you've just collaborated with these mealworms, kind of signing their death warrant and sending them off to be eaten again. And so that's something that feels like an easy fix, but I'm not perfectly happy with it yet. And so what I've been looking at more recently is like how you sort of create a kind of bit of a ritual around the end of life, because you can't just reintroduce them back into the ecosystem, because if there's like 500 mealworms suddenly introduced into an area that isn't supposed to be there, that can then upset the local habitat. And so is there kind of an ethical way of creating end of life at the end of it, is sort of what I've been looking at, and sort of almost creating like a ceremony for each of the mealworms and thanking them for their work as they kind of move on. Because basically with mealworms, they're not actually worms, they're larvae, and they metamorphosize into beetles. And so at the pupating stage, they're kind of in this kind of dormant sort of state. You could basically maybe then kind of put them out and they might get eaten by something or whatever. And that sort of puts them at RIP mealworm at that point. And sort of you are then able to kind of move on without necessarily upsetting an ecosystem or supporting another ecosystem that you don't necessarily support. It's definite like guilt there for sure. And I think it does make you question whether or not like it is the right thing to do. And I think insects is just like such an interesting gray area where they move around, they can sense things, they can see things, but they're not quite at the level of animals, right? Which would be a no-go. But people are really happy to do it with mycelium, and like curing mycelium and killing it is like a staple part of the process. But then maybe some people would argue that mycelium are actually more intelligent than larvae, right? Because they are able to communicate via networks and things like that. And so I think, yeah, a lot of this is trying to dive into like what is there a right and wrong is kind of the tricky thing. And I think you sort of go back to Princess Mononoke, like the relationship that we have with nature there is really messy. And it's like, there isn't really a right or a wrong. Like you don't really see, apart from like the humans trying to destroy the forest, like the forest is pretty brutal back to the humans. And like, there is this kind of like powerlessness that we have to nature, and eventually like once we're all gone, nature's going to kind of take back over the earth. It might not look the way that it is now, but it has a way of always coming back long after we're gone. And so I think there is something about being able to, I guess, grapple with it and at least try and do the right thing, even if it's not perfect. And I think I'd much rather be doing that than sort of ignoring nature and just working within this very like siloed system of just working within these industrial processes that we feel are safe and we've created for ourselves, but are actually causing much more damage by ignoring all the other stuff that's out there.
And I think in our society, or at least Western society, we have such a cognitive dissonance of the natural cost of product or of something that's benefiting us. I think so much of it is just about not looking away and recognizing that and being like, okay, that's happened and now I have this. It's not a moral judgment, it's just more of a almost giving credit to the thing that's come before. So you work a lot with mealworms, but you also mentioned earlier that you're starting to work with wood as a non-human intelligent thing, which I guess for me is like even harder to get my head around, because you can see an animal move, you can understand that it like has a nervous system and that there's a form of intelligence there. But I guess the way that we see wood is we see it as being such a like inert object. So what do you do with wood that showcases wood's non-human intelligence?
So there's various ways that wood has intelligence. I guess at a living tree level, there's a common term called like plant migration. And so like the way that trees are able to move across planets and things like that, but it's just happening at like a non-human timescale. And I think that was the kind of big shift in thinking for me working with wood, was like trying to not think at human timescales, but thinking at like the timescales of the tree, basically. And so there's a lot of action going on, but when we see it on the surface, it seems like it's an inanimate object that's just sort of sat there. But over the course of 100 years, they're super dynamic and they can move around. They can create massive networks. They can totally change their shape and physiology and things like that. And so there's a lot of interesting things going on at a non-human timescale. And so that sort of became a starting point. And I think through that research just became obsessed with trying to showcase a new side of woods that maybe we hadn't quite appreciated yet. I think it's sort of a material we kind of like, but we also sort of devalue it to an extent. It's just sort of another thing that, you know, maybe we'll make a chair out of, something like that. And so there's this thing called hygromorphic actuation. And a few researchers basically discovered that, you know how like wood, when, you know, you see like an old house, like a wood beams and stuff, they'll kind of warp out of shape when they're exposed to moisture. They basically figured out that you're able to control the way that wood moves by having a hydrophobic layer, like a layer that repels water on one side. And so what happens is one side stays fairly intact and then the other side swells a lot and you get these big actuations. And so what I started creating were passively powered wood robots. And so these wood robots are basically, you put them outside, get exposed to moisture either through rain or fog or whatever, and then they'll move and they'll do one step per hydration cycle. And so it'll do one step and then it will dry and then it'll do another step. And so the idea was that you're creating like walking wood, almost inspired by this like plant migration thing, but you're creating a device. And I think that, you know, it was more of a abstract exercise just to see if you could make it happen. But I think there's actually interesting applications for that in terms of creating interventions at a non-human timescale. So for instance, maybe you could create like a reseeding device, right? So if you're rewilding, you want to, instead of like having to employ hundreds of humans to go around planting all these trees or seed bombs and things like that, you could just have like a bunch of seeds on one device and it's kind of planting them slowly over time in a more kind of natural but augmented and controlled sort of way, so that you're able to rewild in a slightly more intentional way potentially. And then, you know, these devices could be biodegradable, and so you don't have to worry about what happens at the end of life. They can sort of feed into the ecosystem because they're totally made out of timber. And so I think there's something interesting in creating things that operate at these non-human timescales and are able to intervene at non-human timescales, because we just get bored. Our attention spans are so short. And so if we create devices that are able to kind of take that load of us of having to worry about things for a long period of time, I think that could be really interesting. And so then you're harnessing this kind of wood way of working at really long timescales, but doing it in a way that is able to help save the forest and things like that. I find that super fascinating.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of that meme that's like, if all dads went to therapy, and then it shows like a futuristic image of like, have you seen this meme?
I don't know if
it's
I
like
have.
The future. I'm got such meme brain rot. But basically, it like shows a future, and it's like a techno-futurist image. I mean, I'm doing way too much analysis of it, but I think what's really cool about this like wood project and this reseeding using these wood robots is that you're showing this alternative techno-futurism that's reliant on old knowledge and historic knowledge and really tapping into the knowledge of nature. And I think that's what's so amazing about your whole approach, is it's saying we can do really cool stuff, we can design really cool stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have to be this computerized metal thing. Like, it can actually be very soft and very organic and very collaborative. And I think one of my final questions is, through your work, what do you hope the wider societal takeaway is?
Yeah, I think I really agree with what you said. It's sort of this alternative future and redefinition of technology, basically, as something that is in synchronicity or in sync with nature. I think that's kind of the ultimate goal, is to really get people, you know, like you read like a sci-fi book or you watch a sci-fi film and it's like cold, hard, sterile. We've killed everything. We're out in space and everything goes at like 1,000,000 miles per hour. And I think like that future has value. You know, I think there's something interesting in that, imagining those scenarios. But there's not enough, I think, about the future where we've actually collaborated with nature. And it's very rare to read about that or to see that sort of future. And so I think taking that technology and sort of showing people this could really be a viable future, it just needs to take time and it will take effort. And it totally requires rethinking these systems. I think that's the main takeaway for me. And I think being able to inspire people to like just dive a bit deeper. I think the more you learn about this stuff, the more interesting it gets as well. And so I've tried to showcase a lot of these kind of, they're not even that complex, but I think the way that they're just described in academic research just sounds really dull and boring. And so showing it in practicality, showing it in a way that, oh, you see the mealworms eating the polystyrene. Oh, you see the wood actually moving. Oh, you see the mycelium growing and fusing things together. And you see that with your own eyes. You're like, oh, I understand. And then all the possibilities start kind of whirring in your brain. And so I'm just trying to spark people's imaginations to think, oh, this could be an alternative future using all this stuff that we're only really now discovering about nature. Well, rediscovering about nature, yeah.
No, I think you're so right, because I think there's so much of this interspecies interaction, actor network theory, like it's a very Latourian approach in academia, but the way it's written is so inaccessible and so like dull and like, I mean, to be honest, like a lot of it's very like masturbatory. It's so like, I'm very clever, listen to my clever words. I'm not going to make it very understandable, but that's on you for not being clever enough to understand me. Whereas actually, like, the role of the communicator is to make something interesting and accessible and fun. And I think that's the place of design in this, to kind of get those dull theories in front of people who don't necessarily want to sit and read Latour, and instead be like, look at this thing. Isn't it cool? Isn't it amazing? I think that's really where I see the place of design in this, and it's playful. Are there any future projects that you're really excited about, or anything that you have in the works, or like anywhere that you'd love to take this sort of approach?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different projects on at the minute. I think the one that I'm quite interested in is basically empowering activists in the especially like tree conservation space, trying to like get people the tools to be able to kind of take action and be able to preserve forests. And so I've been very obsessed with like old growth forests in the UK. And we have a lot of policies at the minute that means that we can't cut them down, but who knows where we'll be in 100 years time. And so I've been looking at different ways of being able to potentially insert devices and things like that into the tree. Because I don't know if you've seen it, but like trees are able to grow around like barbed wire and benches and things like that. Like, as I say, they seem static, but they're very dynamic over a long period of time and almost quite unstoppable. And so almost harnessing that ability to grow around things, can you insert something in a tree that will prevent it from being cut down in the future? And so there's quite sort of, it's quite controversial. There's sort of this technique called, it's not called tree tapping, but it's basically when you get a big rod and you like basically hammer it into the tree, and that basically ruins the tree from being used as timber, because people want really long, perfect, unblemished strips, as well as it kind of discolors it as well. And so that's quite dangerous. Like someone who comes in with like a chainsaw, it can like kick back and like people have like been cut and things like that, which is obviously very extreme. And I personally am not, I think if you are an activist for the planet, you also don't want to like hurt humans as well. So I'm not that happy I wouldn't want to like condone that, but I'm wondering if there's sort of more ethical ways of devaluing the tree, right? So maybe it just sprays the whole thing in ink.
I love it as an approach because it's kind of like you're giving the tree a piercing.
But I think there's other ways of doing it. Joe Bloggs, who's cutting down the tree, isn't in charge of deciding when the trees get cut down, right? And so I think, yeah, there is a value framework of devaluing it for timber and logging, and then raising the value for biodiversity through these interventions is a really interesting design challenge. So that's something that I've been researching and chatting to people about and trying to figure out. And then also all my stuff has a craft, it's called biocrafting. So I've also been looking at mycelium, and I think there's a lot of interesting developments there, but I think people are weirdly already kind of losing interest in it as a material, which is crazy to me, because I guess it's a good sign. I think when something becomes boring, it means that it's actually like viable as a wide scale solution potentially. But I think you also have to inject some creativity into it. And so I think a lot of these startups like Bio, they're doing great work, but at the same time, they're also just kind of going for the most obvious way of being able to use the mycelium. And so I've got a couple projects that I'm collaborating on with someone else on trying to bring that kind of craft element into working with mycelium, which I won't reveal too much because I feel like if I talk about the project too much, it just won't happen. It's one of those things, like the closer you guard it to yourself, it ends up, but I'm excited about trying to inject a bit of creativity into that space, because it doesn't make sense to me that people are bored of it already. Like, it should be an exciting thing, but people just aren't pushing the material to the limit yet. And so that's kind of where I'm looking at mycelium.
Okay, amazing. And where can people find you if they want to learn more about your work?
Yeah, so my website's biocrafting.studio, and we've got a couple case studies of various bits that I've been working on. You can find us on Instagram on biocrafting_studio. And then my own work as well is, my Japanese name is Takao. So it's Takao makes things on Instagram as well.
Amazing. Okay, and I also will put those in the show notes for everyone. Thank you so much to Will for joining me today. I loved how this conversation really challenged the traditional boundaries of design and made me rethink about how we could be more symbiotic with nature. If you want to learn more about his work, I've linked his handles in the show notes. And as always, it would be amazing if you could subscribe to How to Make Climate Change Sexy wherever you listen to your podcasts, leave a review, and follow Sexy Climate Change on Instagram for more regular content. Also, thank you so much to Tanya for the audio editing, Grace for the music, and Josie for the new look of Sexy Climate Change. See you next time. Bye!